I think this question about what it means to feel alive is so important. It kind of derives from a quote that I go back to a lot from the mythologist Joseph Campbell. He said, "I don't think people are seeking the meaning of life as much as they are seeking the experience of being alive." And I think that's really characteristic of our culture right now, that we have such a heavy emphasis on figuring out the meaning of everything that we miss the pleasure of just being alive and the incredible feeling that comes with that. Some people call it a sense of vitality or aliveness. It's something that I think people are really thirsty for. And I think it's something forest therapy really provides for people. So forest therapy, what is it depends on who you ask. There's a lot of people in the world who are coming from an academic background, coming from a research background, that are very focused on the idea of forest therapy is about human health outcomes. In some part, this derives from the origin story of Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing in Japan. The very brief story about that is that in the 1980s, the Japanese were experiencing a shift from an outdoor economy to a mostly indoor economy, and the government noticed a huge spike in cancer and autoimmune disease. So they started many different research projects, one of which was asking the question, what happens when we expose humans to the forest environment? And one of the things that they discovered is that trees keep themselves healthy by showering themselves in these chemicals called phytoncides. Phyton meaning plant, side meaning killer. So phytoncides are like the tree's immune system. If a fungus is attacking the tree diffuses these phytoncides into the air, and they find the fungus and they attack it and they kill it, thus preserving the health of the tree. What's interesting is because all humans have ancestors that evolved under the canopy of trees, we have evolved that when we inhale phytoncides, it triggers the production of these special white blood cells called natural killer cells, or NK cells. And NK cells are part of your innate immune system, which means they're not looking for particular diseases, they're looking for stressed cellular growth that could turn into cancer, and they preventatively kill it. So the Japanese said, wow, this is incredible. You know, this is basically a form of immune boosting health just to keep people healthy. It's not about fighting cancer necessarily, it's about keeping our immune systems healthy so that we don't develop cancer. Now, that's just one of many, 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 many things that are quantifiable about why forest therapy is important. But if you ask me what forest therapy is about, it's about reciprocity and about relationship. One of the ways that Amos developed our practice of forest therapy is he noticed that when people would go on a vision fast, they would have a really profound experience that would be healing the damaged relationships they have with themselves, with sense of this moment, this sense of time, with other human beings, with their relationships in the human world, and their relationships in the more than human world. And he said to himself, this is really important medicine for our time. However, there's an accessibility problem here. Most people don't have the time or the money or the desire or the physical ability to do a vision fast. It's a 12-day ceremony with 4 days of fasting out on the land, no eating, no talking to anyone, no shelter, right? Wow. So that how do we construct an experience that is scaled down to a point that it becomes accessible? And that's where forest therapy comes in. So I really feel like it's a dangerous idea in some respect to think about forest therapy as a modality for human health outcomes, because the way we define health is really important. For me, health means the health of all beings, that we cannot have human health if we don't have healthy waters and healthy trees and healthy earth and healthy sky, healthy animals, you know? So Jacques Cousteau took this wonderful quote from an African forester named Baba Dioum, who said, we only protect what we love. And so part of the idea with forest therapy is how do we actually teach a pedagogy of love to people so that they want to protect the earth And it's not even about protection, it's just about love, right? How do we get people to form a strong relationship in
Right.
such a way that the healing and the self-care and the rest are the collateral impacts of just having a good relationship with the earth? So many people can go outside and not need forest therapy, right? If
Okay.
you want to inhale phytoncides, just go sit with a tree for a while, you know? If you want to be doing the emotional and what you could call the psycho-spiritual work of developing relationship with the world, that's where a forest therapy walk is quite different than just a walk in the woods. So one of the ways that we operate is by basically shifting people from their cognitive process into a somatic and embodied process. This is something that you kind of need a little help with. I guess we're getting into the question of what does a guide do now?
Right.
But
Yeah.
you know, a lot of people have the experience with yoga where going to a yoga class and having a yoga teacher is really different than trying to do it by yourself or from a YouTube video or something like that, because there are effectively two roles in the equation. The first is the person doing the healing work, and the other person is holding the container for them. You know, they're keeping track of the time, they know where you're going, they're, holding you in such a way that you don't have to really think about anything. And that's the important point, is that we don't want to be thinking. We want to be fully in our bodies, in our hearts, in our imaginal sense. This is where the bridge of connection can be created between humans and the more than human world. Whereas if you are solely responsible for doing the work and holding the container, it's counterproductive because you're exhausting yourself. And that's not what we're trying to do, right?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that sounds wonderful. So how do you cultivate love between the forest therapy participant and the more than human world? How does that work?
Well, we say that the forest is the therapist, the
I love
guide
that.
brings the door. This is kind of the core maxim by which we train guides. And the first important thing to understand is that relationships, they're kind of like, snowflakes. There is no standardized relationship. There's no standardization of how to teach relationship. And so as a guide, first, I'm not here to analyze the participants and prescribe what I think they need. I'm here to create a space where each individual participant can find their own authentic relationship with the forest. And then what comes out of that is really dependent on the person and the place and how they're interacting with each other. So even on a forest therapy walk where, let's say, I have 10 people, those 10 people are having 10 unique experiences. And I shouldn't really pigeonhole it into saying it's all going to be love. You know, love is one manifestation of how it might turn out, but somehow the forest tends to offer people what they need and what is appropriate for them in that moment. Um, I feel like the forest kind of speaks in a symbolic or an archetypal language that we can understand when we drop into a state of embodiment and we release ourselves from the cognitive process and the obsession of trying to figure it all out, right? So once I get you to just slow down and awaken your senses and focus on being in your body and then send you out onto the land with different invitations we use can yield different results with different people. And it just depends on kind of how the forest is operating in that moment. But what they receive is a method of connection. I
Right.
think part of the problem, like the opposite of love in this kind of theoretical construct, isn't hate, it's disconnection, it's apathy, it's numbness. It's the opposite of aliveness, it's the opposite of relationship. So people can feel connected through so many different sensations that prompt them to have that experience of aliveness. And love and gratitude are certainly kind of thematic things that we see awe and wonder and, vitality, and all of these things can come up. But it's interesting that also sometimes connection can come through discomfort, and that
Oh,
we're not trying to shield people necessarily from the reality of their relationship. So one time I was on a walk and someone sat somewhere that had a lot of ants, and the ants kind of, climbed up on him, and he kind of jumped in the creek and washed these ants off him. And he got bit a few times, but he was saying, those ants are like teachers as well, that I wasn't really paying attention. And
right.
so the symbolic language that comes through that interaction with the forest then takes on meaning cast through the prism of his own consciousness and experience. That I didn't tell him that the point of going and sitting there was to learn how to pay attention, but
Right.
somehow the forest taught him that in that way. And at the same time, the other people on the walk were having diverse experiences that weren't about that. So it's like this sense of connection can come through in so many different ways, that ultimately it's about developing a connection and a relationship, and then that can lead us into a sense of love or a sense of just being in. I mean, when we think about our human relationships, it's not monolithic. It's not like I just love this thing all the time. Relationships are dynamic and complex, and they encapsulate many different emotional experiences. That's what makes them rich and interesting. So just like a relationship with a human being, we shouldn't try to pigeonhole a relationship with nature into a romantic idea that it's just going to be all sunshine and rainbows all the time, right?
Right. Right. Yeah. There
I think
might
it's
be snakes
right,
or
right. And
or poison ivy or
the
poison.
indigenous teachers of many traditions talk about how Creator put every plant and every animal on this earth to teach us something. And
Right.
like the poison oak that's in my region, the Chumash people called that the protector plant. They said this plant is here to teach you about respect and boundaries. So
Right.
I like to kind of tell people about that. I don't think these things are hazards, and it doesn't help us to kind of demonize one set of things because we don't like them and hold another up because we like them. Like, oh, this wild rose is so beautiful, but this poison oak is so horrible. These things are teachers, and they have different lessons to teach us. And the whole circle, it's kind of coming back to that idea of the council circle.
Right.
Every voice in the circle holds wisdom, but at the center of the circle, that's where the culmination of that wisdom resides. And when we learn how to listen to that center, then we're really experiencing the full connection to nature. I'm reading this wonderful book right now. It's by a scholar named Gary Lockman. It's called The Lost Knowledge of Imagination. And he talks about how since the Enlightenment, we've been having kind of a cultural experience of judging that the imaginal is not real, and only what is quantifiable and observable is real. And he says this is really dangerous because for thousands of years, humans have had these dual ways of perceiving reality. That yes, we are equipped with this incredible scientific capacity to measure quantifiable phenomenon. And then there's this other stuff that is not quantifiable. How do you measure love? How do you measure joy? How do you measure connection? How do you measure these things? That's the stuff I think is really the interesting stuff. It's somehow the people that come on a forest therapy walk find unexpected things. And I always think it's a good sign for me when someone's evaluation of the walk says, I didn't get anything I wanted, but I got everything that I needed from this experience. And I say, yes.
Wow.
Thank you, Forrest.
Yes. And things like love and joy, the unquantifiable things that you spoke of, that's the thing that those are the things that really matter to people,
Yes.
you know? So I'd love for you to explain or describe, say, if someone was to come on one of these forest walks, what are the invitations that you offer? What are the things that people might find themselves doing? I know it's different for each person and each place, but do you just let people go off and walk, or do you have certain activities that you would you would have them
So yeah, we call them
participate?
invitations very consciously because we don't like the word activity or exercise. It kind of insinuates that there's a right or a wrong way to do it, or a better or a worse way that you can get good at it. And I always tell people, you're all going to be doing this perfectly. Like, there's no way to do this wrong. It's really about finding your authentic way of engaging this invitation. The 3 hour walk, a typical walk is 3 hours, although we can scale that, out or in. But typically, the walk follows what we call a standard sequence of invitations. And this is structured around a liminal journey. So if you've studied Campbell, or there's many mythologists that use this idea, on a hero's journey, there's usually a threshold of what Campbell calls separation. That's where the hero leaves the world that is comfortable, the world that he or she is used to, and embarks on this journey to discover something new within themselves. We don't like to call it the threshold of separation. We like to call it the threshold of connection, because we say that most people are already separated. Separation is kind of the endemic state of our culture.
Right.
So the threshold of connection comprises two invitations. The first is called the pleasures of presence. And essentially, this is a sensory meditation, but we don't like to call it meditation either, because when people hear the word meditation, all of a sudden they have an idea in their head of what it's supposed to be and what it's supposed to feel like and how their behavior should be modified based on that word. So we just call it the pleasures of presence. And basically, it's a facilitated experience of awakening all of our senses. Of course, we have the Aristotelian five senses, but then we also work with an expanded palette of human senses that science is now catching up to. Then after that, we have an invitation called What's in Motion. And What's in Motion is basically a slow walk down the trail where we notice everything around us that is moving. And the idea is the first invitation shifts your focus from what's going on in your mind to what's going on in your body. So this allows us to achieve a state of embodiment. And then the second invitation helps us slow way, way, way down. Essentially, once you've gotten those two pieces in place, the way I like to describe it is then the participant is capable of speaking and listening to the symbolic language of the more than human world. They're not ready to do the real connecting work until these prerequisite pieces have been laid down. You can't just go and first thing say, okay, go sit with a tree. People are going to say, what? What do you mean? And they're going to feel agitated, right? Because they're not ready to do that work yet. So we always start with pleasures of presence, what's in motion, and then the middle of the walk, the guide and the land work in partnership to develop invitations about connecting to what is there. So if I'm guiding on the beach, those invitations probably have something to do with the water or the sand or the dunes. If I'm guiding in the forest, maybe there's trees, maybe there's a river, maybe there's stone, whatever it is, those middle invitations, we're trying to help people connect with the beings that live in that place and to develop a connection through sensory experience. I'm not telling you what it all means. I'm trying to get you to experience the world primarily through your body. And then somehow the symbolic language reveals itself to each person, and each person interprets that symbolic language through the prism of their own experience, their own consciousness, right? And then, like all journeys, they must come to an end. And there's a threshold on the way out of the walk called the threshold of incorporation. Incorporation comes from the Latin in corpus, so to bring it into the body. And we have a tea ceremony at the end of our walk where we gather some plants from the trail that are, of course, safe to make tea from. And we sit in a circle around the teapot. And there's a final round of sharing where we ask people, what would you like to say to make this feel complete today? And really, the way you could conceptualize that is it's an opportunity for harvesting the wisdom of the whole experience and bringing it into something that is very concise. That's something you are bringing into your body. And that's what you're walking away from, or with, excuse me. So the T is both a literal and a metaphorical incorporation practice that then marks the end of the walk. And it's interesting because that's kind of where I think the real healing comes in. Yes, of course you have reduced blood pressure, reduced heart rate, boosted immune functioning, attention restoration, stress reduction. All of these things are collateral impacts. But what changes psychologically or emotionally about the person? I think of it like planting a seed in consciousness. And it's not like a bolt of lightning, like, boom, your whole life is different. It's usually a very quiet and gentle awakening that then comes back into the world with you and helps you with self-care. And I think when we learn how to take care of ourselves, then we start taking care of those around us with, greater levels of efficacy. So sometimes what people are taking away seems very simple. It's just, I need to slow down more, or I need to remember to do nothing once in a while. And these things, for someone that maybe isn't thinking about how profound this can be for someone, sometimes I see people say these things with tears in their eyes because they've forgotten how to take care of themselves, and they've forgotten that there's so much healing and so much support in the more than human world that they've cut themselves off from. It's interesting. One of the thematic things I see a lot in trainings is we'll get people in their 50s and 60s who at some point in the training will have a very emotional moment, and they'll say, when I was a little girl, I remember that I was friends with the trees. And then at some point in my childhood, my mother, father, brother, sister, grandma, teacher told me that that was stupid, and I stopped. What have I been doing for the last 40 years? How much of my relationship have I neglected? So what can seem like something very simple, just I need to slow down, can actually be very profound for people. And one of the things I always tell people about forest therapy is that we're not about teaching you anything, it's a remembering process. I really truly believe that everything that people experience, it's not new. It's something that we're born with. It's something that is part of like our DNA, you know? I'm not some, mystical arts guru here to teach anything new. I'm just holding this space to help people remember what wholeness feels like, what connection feels like, what vitality feels like, what awe feels like. And these things are all within us. It's just the culture, the damage our culture has done to us by numbing us, and making us so preoccupied with our mental space that we've forgotten how to feel anything at all. It's interesting also that so much of our trauma is stored somatically, it's stored in the body. And so when we get people into the body, a lot of healing can happen that is not being contained necessarily by my expertise as a forest therapy guy, but every single time this happens, I just trust that the forest knows what to do and can hold people in that space, and it always does. I had a walk a few years ago that was very memorable. A woman came back from an invitation that most people came back laughing and smiling. And this woman came back and she said, I was sitting with this tree and I saw the bark and it reminded me of the wrinkles in my grandfather's face. And I realized I had never cried, and he passed 10 years ago. And I just started crying, and the tree just absorbed those tears, and it was like I was there with him. That's kind of that symbolic communication that I was describing earlier. I didn't tell her to have that experience. It already lived within her. And then the sensory experience, the touching of the bark, the being there, the seeing it, that awoke this experience within her. So it's that kind of stuff, I can't make things happen for people, but the forest somehow provides those things.
That's amazing and so beautiful. How many, and what you were talking about, connection and feeling, being in the body, these are themes that have come through the whole entire conference. And it's so important, and trauma stored in the body. And I just love this story, or the way the forest is the therapist. It's just beautiful. And I did want to ask, how many senses are we up to now? Is it something like 53?
That really depends on who you ask also. It's also kind of a challenging thing to describe from like a rational, logical approach, because you think about your sense of taste has 5 sub senses in it, right?
Okay.
Your sense of sight has different qualities to it, your sense of touch. So these things can be broken down into kind of more discrete pieces. But then also we have pieces that aren't widely recognized, like our sense, of proprioception, for
Yeah.
instance. And then there are some senses where I don't think we really quite have the language to describe what it is. Like Lockman's book talks about the difference between imaginary and imaginal. So
Okay.
imaginary is the ability of humans to create fantasies and escape into them, whereas the imaginal is the ability for humans to use the force of the imagination to perceive reality. So you might describe the imaginal as a sense. It's not so much a, like we think about senses as something that are not part of our, they're part of our autonomic nervous system, right? We don't control our senses. We don't choose what we smell or how we experience texture. It's not something that we are directing consciously. So I don't know if you've ever had an experience like this where through the force of imagination, something happens that you're not creating it. You're not creating a fantasy and saying, "Ooh, I'd really love it if this tree started talking to me." It's as if something mysterious is happening that is spontaneous, and you didn't create it and you didn't necessarily see it coming. It's just arising in consciousness. So in that way, there are many layers to this idea about the human sensory apparatus that I just don't feel like we're quite caught up to yet. I mean, when Aristotle identified the 5 senses, it was this huge revolution. And now, we know that there are many, many more. And this is not the end of the story. There's
No.
probably a lot more that we don't understand about how experience works, how phenomenology works. How does this human body interact with the world?
Hmm. Yes. Yes, and I've very definitely had things happen like that to
Yeah.
me.
And
And
this thing about having an experience like that, I also feel like it's not necessarily important how it happens. What's important is that it happens at all.
yes,
We work within a pedagogical framework of storytelling as opposed to kind of facts,
right.
because a fact is monolithic. We can argue about a fact,
Right.
who is right. But we can't argue about a story because a story is multivalent. It speaks to each of us in different ways, and we each receive what we need from it or what we can take from it. So when people ask me about this stuff where people have an experience where they feel like a tree has said something to them, I'll say, okay, I have 4 stories about the trees. And I should credit Amos for developing a good part of this. So the first story is a scientific story. It's called projection, that if I'm talking to the tree, the wisdom is within me and I'm projecting it onto the tree. The second story you could call a kind of a shamanistic or a pagan story, which is that if a tree is talking to me, the wisdom is in the tree and I'm receiving it. The third story we could call a counsel story, which is that if I'm experiencing the tree speaking to me, the wisdom is not in me, not in the tree, but in the relationship between. That's the voice that I'm hearing. And the fourth story is a Zen story. It's that there is no separation between me and tree. So it's really just the voice of the universe speaking to itself. Now, when I tell these stories, I tell people, does it matter which one is important or which one is correct? Is it important to identify why it's happening? And most times we agree it's not really important why it happens.
Right.
But if that is a pathway towards healing for people, that's significant.
Mm,
Sometimes we don't need to have all the answers. Sometimes the questions are, equally as valid and wonderful.
mm,
I often feel like people don't necessarily fully comprehend the power of the body to be the source of relationship. They think about relationships up here, but sometimes I invite people to imagine, let's say, uh, imagine someone that you definitely love, maybe a parent, sibling, partner, child, and imagine I've given you a book and it has all the facts about them. It has where they were born, where they grew up, where they went to school, who their friends were, what their favorite activities are, favorite foods, whatever, everything. Now imagine you have that book, but you've never seen the person, you've never smelled them, you've never touched them, you've never heard the sound of their voice, you have no sensory contact with the person at all. Could you fall in love knowing everything about someone, but having no physical connection? And most people agree no, because love begins as a somatic process. It's this sense of connection. And when we abstract things and intellectualize them and turn them into concepts, they actually get further away from us.
mm,
They get further away from our hearts. So when I take people on a forest therapy walk or I'm training forest therapy guides, I'm really trying to focus on the idea that this is not about facts or knowledge. This is about connection. And we don't want to distract people with concepts or intellectualizing ideas about what is nature.
right.
That's not important, you know?
Mm, yeah, definitely. Oh my goodness. I wonder if there are any other amazing stories you could share with us. Just one more story, maybe. Um, because I enjoyed hearing it so much, the last one.
Yeah.
Um, maybe something that, you know, became bigger, maybe helped to heal the world as a result.
Yeah, I mean, I think the healing of the world starts with very small things. Like I said, it's not a big dramatic impact necessarily. It kind of deepens over time as we cultivate these relationships. One of the stories that I find really touching that I've experienced in my career is I didn't hear this story until I read about it in a WebMD article because I had a WebMD journalist on this walk, and the story didn't come out during the walk. So I heard about it after the fact. So in the middle of the walk, I had sent my participants on an invitation I call Treasure Hunt. It's basically, I'd like to suggest that this forest is holding a treasure for you. Wander out with an open heart, see what reveals itself. So this woman had come with her husband, and we're in kind of like a canyon. So this woman wanted to climb up the wall of the canyon to see the view of the mountains. And she gets there and she kind of scrambles up, and then her footing goes loose and she kind of slides back down. Not injured, just slides back down to the bottom. And she says, "Oh, okay, I'm going to try that again." So she goes up and she comes back down, and she goes up and she comes back down. And she does this a bunch until she kind of feels frustrated that the forest is not really being very cooperative. And she looks over and she sees her husband sitting under a tree, and she goes and sits next to him, and without saying anything, he just takes her hand and holds it. And then she said, "That was my treasure." And it's like, it's so simple. Just being, just being alive, just being
Mm,
there with someone you love and not needing to describe it or justify it in any way. And I don't know why she was going the other direction at first, and then maybe the forest was kind of pushing her back towards this and saying, "No, this is not the treasure you seek." you know
yeah.
Go over here. There's a lot of moments like this where people have a very kind of beautiful but simple revelation about what the good life is, what aliveness is. Sometimes it can be almost mysterious. Like, I had a training earlier this year where um, at the end of our week-long training, we have a group come. We recruit people from the public, and the people we've trained guide their first walk in teams. And a woman came with her son who was on the spectrum, an adult, but on the spectrum. And in the middle of the walk, she received a phone call, and she basically just excused herself from the walk for about 90 minutes. And then tea ceremony came, and her son called out to her and said, Mom, we're having tea, you should come back, we're finishing the walk. And she came back, and you could tell something had happened. She was very tender, and she shared with the group that her daughter had called, and that in her normal life, day to day, she's taking care of her son, and she doesn't have time to talk to her daughter. And it was like she knew that the forest and that the group was holding him in such a way that he was taken care of, and she didn't need to worry about him. And that opened the opportunity for her to have a very connecting experience with her daughter. And it's kind of funny because someone said to me later, I really feel like the guides should have had everyone turn off their phone. Like, I didn't like that she was on her phone. And I kind of said, that's just your judgment. She
Yeah.
had this amazing experience. And, this is going to sound a little on the woo-woo end of things, but maybe technology also holds its own place in the consciousness of the earth, and that, the phone is made from the earth too.
Absolutely. Yes. It's
Developed from this place. And I'll share with you one more just because it popped into my mind. So we did a training in Costa Rica a couple years back, and we were in a pretty agricultural province. So the people we recruited from the public walk were all farmers, and they were all like third and fourth generation farmers on this land. And these are kind of like macho outdoor guys, And by tea ceremony, they were all in tears because they said, when I walk this land, all I see is work that needs to be done. I forgot that this land can also nurture me. It can also be like the embrace of a mother or a friend, that, this isn't just, my relationship with this place isn't just about work. It's about love. It's about connection. It's about self-care. It's about being taken care of and taking care. That's where the reciprocity comes, when we understand that our healing and the healing of the earth are intertwined with each other, then this whole problem starts unraveling kind of naturally. Like, I always tell my mentees when working with people, you can't open a rose with a crowbar. You can't make something beautiful happen by force.
right.
And I think that's kind of also a commentary on social change and environmentalism, that I personally don't feel like we can succeed in our mission to restore health and balance by using tactics of aggression and shame and force and violence,
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for sharing those beautiful stories. I got choked up a couple of times. This has just been wonderful. Everything you shared has just been beautiful. So thank you so much for your time. I wonder if you can tell me or tell the participants here on the conference how they can learn more and maybe find a guide that's in their area.
Yeah, I'd love to. So you can go to the association's website. It's www.natureandforesttherapy.org. And the website has an incredible amount of resources on it. You can learn more about taking the guide training there as well. We'll be doing probably about 20 trainings in 2020, including United States, Canada, Europe, Asia, Australia, Latin America, South America. We're going all over the place.
Wow.
And there's also a guide locator map where guides who are members of the association can locate themselves on the map, and you can find people that way.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'll put a link under the video.
Fabulous.
So just click on that. And I know you have a beautiful gift for the audience. Would you like to say a little bit about that?
Sure. Amos and I co-authored this very short ebook called The ANFT Way Forest Therapy. And basically, this particular book arose out of a question about international standards in forest therapy, because right now, it's kind of an interesting wild ride for me to be involved with this whole process of defining forest therapy. When we started at ANFT, it was very fringe, and there was the Japanese practice of Shinrin-yoku, which is quite dissimilar from ours, although it's a wonderful practice. And in Europe, particularly right now, we're seeing an incredible amount of energy and interest in defining forest therapy and helping create public programming around it. The question arises of who is defining forest therapy? What does it mean? And at ANFT, like I told you earlier, our big thing is we really are holding steady to the idea that this is not about extracting human health from nature. That's the kind of thinking that got us to the problematic place we are in already.
Right.
So part of the forest therapy movement is reconceptualizing the way we think about the more than human world.
Mm.
And the book speaks to that question and speaks to kind of the pedagogical and philosophical approach that ANFT brings to the field.
Perfect. And that's on the page too. Just click the free link and you'll be able to get this ebook. Thank you so much, Ben. It's just been wonderful. Thank you for your time and sharing all your beautiful wisdom.
Of course, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.